Hello guys, welcome back. We're going to be painting something new today, as is the case every day. We do a miniature here every single day, and I'm really happy when you're able to join me. So, guess what we're going to do today? We're going to do a Dwarf Slayer, specifically a Demon Slayer from 4th edition. Yeah? So, Slayers are amazing things, right? Like, even though I wasn't a huge fan of Warhammer Dwarfs in general, mostly because, well, I was more of an undead player and dwarves were a really, really tough proposition for me to face. There's something about Slayers that's just amazing, right? These are dwarves which are, driven to the point of grief. They've been driven right to the point of breaking, personality wise, and what they did storyline wise was remind you how far dwarves really are from being human. Now a human might be given to depression or might break down if something terrible were to happen to them, but dwarves are a little bit different. They will go on a killing spree essentially to repay their debt to society if something inconsolable were to happen to them. And there's something about that about the dwarf psyche that reveals that's really so compelling and interesting storyline wise. In that sense, a dwarf that suffers an inconsolable shame or loss is unable to continue to function in dwarf society, and they try to give back to society the only way they know how, which is to go out there and kill the biggest, the most dangerous monsters that they can find, ultimately making the world a safer place for dwarf kind. And that's just really, really cool, right? Like, it's just so alien and inhuman, and frankly so inspiring in an odd sort of way. Anyway, this is a demon slayer, meaning it's a slayer that's in a way both the most successful slayer insofar as it's a real killing machine. It's mastered the arts of war, and it really is something of a it is a bit of a maelstrom of destruction on the tabletop. But at the same time, it's also failed to find a monster to end its life and to end its shame. And that's a really cool kind of dichotomy that you don't see a lot in just, well, any genre really for fantasy. Anyway, so we're going to start by doing his flesh. This is a mix of Guilliman flesh and Seraphim Sepia. It's been renamed Seraphim Sepia. It used to be called Gryphhound Sepia. And this really gives you a color that's flesh toned, right? It's kind of got the whole Guilliman flesh look. First of all, I kind of feel like Guilliman flesh out of the bottle is a little bit too intense. It's a bit too thick, and it tends to obscure a lot of the texture on the surface of a miniature. It tends to produce too much of the shade color as a contrast paint, and it doesn't provide enough of the lighter areas. So I tend to, in the beginning, I would like, cut it with like contrast medium, or else add water to it to sort of like weaken it slightly. And then I found that when I did weaken it with contrast medium or water, I found that it tended to become a little bit too pink. So then I hit on the idea of adding like Seraphim Sepia. Now, Seraphim Sepia, new Seraphim Sepia anyway, which was that batch of paint that was released maybe a couple of years ago, reformulated to be more in line with contrast paints. It came out a little bit too weak. But in that sense, it was a perfect fit for fixing both of the problems that I found with Guilliman Flesh at the time. So the fact that Guilliman Flesh was a little bit too pink, the yellow tones in Seraphim Sepia fixed, and likewise the fact that it was a bit too intense. Seraphim Sepia was quite weak. So that countered both of the issues beautifully, and they complemented wonderfully in my opinion. So between these two colors, 1:1 mix, that's my chosen flesh color, and I find it gives me a really good base to work from directly over my undercoat color. Now, I mean, those of you who have been with me for like some time now would know that I don't use a standard color for my undercoats. It is in fact basically a pale gray from a company called Pylox. That's essentially got this really interesting soft warm grey color. And I'll be, as usual, I'll put the colors that I use into my description, so you can feel free to refer to that if you wish to follow along with these techniques. As you know, as you're no doubt sick of hearing, like by now, the whole point of using this color is that it tends to give me a softer, more desaturated result, which I find a little bit more natural to work over. Contrast paint on its own, I find, has a tendency to look a little bit too neon and a bit too intense when applied over white. Yeah, it tends to come out stark white. When contrast paint was originally launched, and I believe these colors are still available now, Wraithbone and was it Grey Seer? Wraithbone and Grey Seer, two colors that they advocate, that Games Workshop advocates that you use contrast paints over. I find both of these colors are quite lacking as well. Grey Seer has the same principle as that Pylox Grey White that I was telling you about. But I find contrast Grey Seer is a little bit too dark, so it does lose a little bit too much saturation. It's a fine thing, you know. In a pinch, I would go ahead and use it, of course, and not everybody has access to the Pylox paint that I love so much, but that's fine. I mean, you make do with what you have, right? So Wraithbone, I find, is a little bit too grey, just a touch. And I find, Grey Seer, I find a little bit too grey. And Wraithbone is an interesting one. Wraithbone is a very pale sand color. When you use a pale sand color and you apply contrast paints over them, they change the color quite significantly. Oh, I just realized I put a swath of this flesh tone over his foot, and he's actually wearing boots, which is a rarity. I expected most slayers to be wearing, well, to be going barefoot, but there you go. So yeah, so what I found is that Wraithbone is a bone color. So whenever you apply contrast paints, especially like the blues or the greens, they tend to go a little bit too far in that spectrum, in my opinion. So I'm not in favor of that either. What I do like is this neutral gray color, and something about it, it seems to have a little bit of almost green in it, which is kind of great. You would not think that would work well with most colors, but you'd be surprised because it doesn't pull the final result too far towards either being really cool colored, like more towards the cold spectrum, or too much towards the warm spectrum, which is like towards the yellows and the reds and the oranges. I find this just works, you know, perfectly for me, and that's basically what I do. So this is one coat of contrast, well, one coat of Guilliman Flesh plus Seraphim Sepia, and you can see it actually gives you a pretty decent flesh effects right out of the bottle. It's got the right mix of dark and light areas, although you will see that we will come back in and we'll reinforce some of the darker areas just to make it a little bit more intense and to give a bit more contrast. But I think it's actually looking pretty good right out of the bottle. So as with this, as all the other episodes of this series, I will not be painting this model to like a fully finished standard. I will be doing it to what I consider a viable tabletop standard. And the idea then is that I will come back to it at some point perhaps, and then work on that to bring out some of the details. Some of the little details that we might be omitting today would include things like gems and, you know, details of his rings and so on. But I think we'll still make it look pretty decent within this one sitting. Okay, cool. So as for his hair on Slayers is typically an iconic orange color. So I like to go a little bit of Iandan yellow, which is a yellow contrast paint, and I like to mix in Gryphhound orange, and that gives us an orange that's a little bit more towards the yellow spectrum. So I don't imagine Slayers constantly dye their hair over and over again, because it has a tendency to fade, right, over time. And I like the idea that, you know, you have a little bit more nuance in that color. The Gryphhound orange on its own would be a little bit too strong in my opinion. Now lately I've noticed with some of the old world releases, they've started doing Slayers with just their mohawks dyed, their haircuts dyed, while leaving their facial hair either brown or grey, as the case may be, undyed as it were. And something about that just doesn't look, it just doesn't feel right to me. I mean, I get the logic behind it, you know. Even in the oldest pieces of fluff, they always described slayers as dyeing their hair, you know, that's been stiffened with to stick out at alarming angles, as I recall, and then, you know, dyeing it to be bright orange, and you know how that created this really iconic look. They never really mentioned anything about facial hair, but I always assume, and the miniatures would support this. I always assumed that they would look better with the same color of facial hair with their beards, right? And it turns out that the beards done like in brown or gray or even sand colored, they look really strange. Something about it looks really dirty. Yeah, I just don't think it suits, right? I just think this may be something to do with the idea that, you know, in real life you may see people with orange hair. People who are ginger, for example, can have really like beautiful orange hair, and you don't see ginger people with different colored beards. Well, I mean, okay, not so starkly different, I guess. You do see, like, you know, as the gray comes out, you know, they can have quite a kingly appearance with a bit of gray in the beard. You know, that's kind of absent on the red hair, but it's not so stark. When you have just so starkly brown hair, brown facial hair coupled with, you know, the hair being bright orange, it just looks dirty to me somehow. It just looks like, you know, somebody's been walking around in like a puddle of mud kind of to his waist. I don't know, don't love that look. I get why they're doing it, I suppose, to differentiate it with the full Fire Slayer thing, which have a very traditional Slayer look, just with the additional helmets and, oh god, with giant lizards and so on. But yeah, I get why they're trying to separate them visually so that people don't conflate the two together. But I don't love the look. It's just not what I grew up with. Yeah, let's just leave it at that. Yeah, it wasn't what I grew up with, and therefore I'm not a huge fan of the way it looks. I would be happy if they did the hair, you know, not orange at all. I would be happy if they did, you know, the hair and beards completely orange. I just don't love the fact that they've kind of gone halvesies. It just doesn't look natural, and it looks just really off to me. So there. Anyway, so we're going to move on to apply this over all of the beard areas. As always, we are doing our signature move of manipulating contrast paint to be the right level of strength, so that we can get a decent. We're aiming for a decent base coat plus shade in one hit, right? Many of the contrast paints, I'm sure you know by now, have either too much pigment in them, or come out of the gate too strong, or else, you know, too weak or similar, or even have no contrast effect. So that's simply because the way I understand it, coming from GW insiders who have left the company, it seems like a lot of these paints were originally created as different ranges, and then with the runaway success of contrast paint, a lot of different types of paint were all branded as contrast paint because they sold better. To be fair, I'm part of the problem, because I certainly bought a lot of paint because they were branded as contrast paint, and I would later find out that, oh, they didn't quite act the same. Nonetheless, it's really up to us to find different ways to use certain kinds of paint, right? So they definitely do have their uses. It's just, it might not be what we expect to get. So in my experience, the colors, the paints that more or less give a small amount of recessed shading, a small amount of edge highlights on the sharpest edges, and then have the largest proportion of color being the mid-tone, those I would consider contrast paints, like real contrast paints. So a perfect example of this would be Ildari Emerald, maybe Croxigor Green. Croxigor Green or Croxigor Blue? That's a good question. Proxigal. What is it? Proxigal scale. Yeah. So yeah, those colors I would consider like actual contrast paint. And then you've got the strange flesh ones. So like plate bearer flesh is a perfect example wherein you would see a strange kind of like pale haze on the underside of the bottle. That needs to be shaken up in order for it to function as a paint. It has a kind of like a matte medium at the bottom, or something to make it pastel looking. So the way they separate is a bit different. That I would consider a different category of paint as well. Likewise, Imperial Fist, for example, a color that doesn't leave a lot of shading recesses and it doesn't pull away quite the same way from the raised areas, would be another example of a color that's not quite a contrast paint, still useful in its own way, but not quite functioning like the one coat contrast paint that, you know, the way it was originally marketed when it first came out. Anyway, all paints have their uses, and it's really up to us to find, you know, how best they serve our needs, and ultimately still you're really useful no matter what you own or choose not to buy, as the case may be. So there is a lot of beard on this chap, as befitting his status as a demon slayer. Demon slayers were the highest level of demons of slayer. You started out as a lowly troll slayer, then you became a giant slayer, then you became a dragon slayer, and lastly you ended up as a mighty demon slayer, right? After years and years of presumably failing at your job, which is fantastic. I would imagine that every time, you know, a slayer like beat the snot out of a monster and killed it, you'll be overcome with a little bit of frustration at the fact that he'd failed yet again, and yet he was doing a service to his people. And that mix of shame and, I guess, frustration with some truly epic deeds was really what made Slayer so fun. That and the fact that they never ever ran away. So they were sometimes really frustrating to deal with because you had to kill every last one of them. They were never really overpowered, in my opinion, simply because they were relatively expensive and they could not wear armor. And yes, even though they would fight to the last man, they were not particularly strong. I remember a particular White Dwarf battle report where uh, essentially a dwarf army faced up against chaos, a chaos army, and that chaos army had chaos knights, all of which could not be hurt by anything below strength 4. And unfortunately, most of the slayers were struggling to hurt a unit of chaos knights for the entire game. A little bit sad, really. Feel bad for the little orange guys as they like sort of, as their blows kind of like pinged harmlessly off the knight's armor. But such is the life. They did, on the flip side, manage to hold up the Chaos Knights for the entire game, or close to it. So that was achieving something. Alright. So now we've got the flesh blocked in, we've got the orange blocked in. Now the thought tends to need to turn towards what to do with the fabric. And there are a handful of dwarf holds which I think would be an appropriate choice. I might go with the traditional character drain for blue. Although it's tempting to do Angrim Iron Fist, it's his dwarf hold as well, which would be more towards magenta. I think they look good in blue though, so I might just go down that route, because I think color schemes need to work first and foremost, as color schemes need to make, you know, the model look attractively balanced. So let's work towards that instead. You've got a model that at this point is overwhelmingly warm, right? Like you don't really see pale flesh on slayers much, but in the interests of differentiating it from the orange, which I think it will be far too close if I did the slayer's flesh darker, I think I might need some blue or green to counteract the color of the warm colors which are kind of running away on the model right now. Yeah, more than likely we'll do blue in order to make it visually more interesting. So we'll give him a little bit of time to dry. Should I go on to do the base right now? Yeah, why not? Let me also take a little bit of this color. So this is, where is it? This is silver gray, which is the rough equivalent color of the Undercoat spray that I use from Pylox. This is a very close approximation to the point where if I apply it over the surface to clean up mistakes like I did on his foot just now, and then I apply a color over it, I really struggle to see the difference. So that suits my purposes just fine, you know, because as is my mantra on this series, like, mistakes are inevitable, so we'll go through them together and we'll fix all these problems along the way. So he's actually dripping with metal. Now that I look at him, he's got lots of metal details. So perhaps we'll do that first while we give the clothing. Well, let's give the beard a little bit of time to dry. Now a little bit of wayward silver gray and orange has combined to create a bit of a disaster over here. What I'm doing is I'm wicking away the color with a damp brush, and then we can go back in and spot the area again in the lighter color, in the cleanup color. Perhaps we'll do the silver now. Yeah, let's do that. So metal, hair, beard, metal, hair, and skin. I think that's the vast majority of any Slayer. I'm using, as usual, my model, my Vallejo Model Air silver, and this is my go-to silver that I've been using for the longest time. I love the way it looks. I love the way it goes on smooth with one coat, and it has a tendency to not gum up the details too much while drying with a fairly smooth surface, and that really accommodates contrast paints rather well. Sometimes it dries a little bit too smooth, I realize. So when that happens, then it's a case of making sure that you don't dilute your contrast paint too much, especially with water, which tends to mess up the surface tension of contrast paint. And then when you apply that over the surface, it tends to coffee stain really badly. If you use contrast medium, generally you get a better result, in my opinion, as I have found. You can also likewise mix up your own medium with a combination of matte medium, a little bit of washing up liquid detergent, essentially, to break the surface tension, as well as a bit of flow improver. Yeah, so let's just apply this to most of the gold areas, being careful not to touch the wet areas of wash, or at least to disrupt it minimally. I'm not too cut up if a little bit of paint works its way into the recesses, because there are still some wet areas. The reason being, when we go on to do the next stage of the flesh, meaning a second coat of the Guilliman flesh Seraphim Sepia mix that I mentioned earlier, where it's needed, you will naturally fill in some of the darker areas, or the areas which are basically, that might have mistakes on them already. So that's not too tragic, I feel. But yeah, it's a good idea to try to limit that if possible. So we might stop short of hitting the edge where it runs into another color. Yeah, so let me make sure I hit all of the little gems. He might not have a lot of armor on, but boy does he have a lot of jewelry. And that's the thing about Slayers as well, right? Like I played Warhammer Quest a lot. I play Warhammer Quest a lot still, right? And the thing about Troll Slayers is that they inevitably acquire a lot of booty because they're such effective fighters. And because of their disdain for armor, they usually... The main way that you could tell how successful a Slayer was how many trinkets and little charms and runes that he acquires over his person. Now the axes are usually festooned with runes, right? Because they're so effective fighters that they've acquired all this stuff over a lifetime of battle. And that's a huge part of this model. It looks amazing how it's essentially crawling with detail. And that's part of what made Slayers really cool. When the Age of Sigmar came and Slayers became their own faction, I didn't really love it. I feel Slayers look best when when they're a minority of an army, when they're the Slayer cult as opposed to the dominant culture of an army. You don't need that many naked dwarves running around to get the point across. When everything's just naked dwarves running around, it kind of looks a bit like trolls, right? Like wish trolls. And it's a bit naff in my opinion. So I didn't love Fire Slayers. Their connection with the Magma Droth lizards made very little sense to me. It's weird that in their old lore, Slayers would go hunting monsters, and then these guys were friends with monsters. Didn't really get it. So I still don't know what Gold is. It's just a weird idea to take the very noble aim of dying in service to your race and to your hold, right? And turn it into a quest for essentially money. It just broke very far from tradition, and I didn't enjoy the transition. But the models were great, I guess. They were interesting models. I did at one point even consider how what kind of color schemes would enhance the look of that army, but I don't think I could bring myself to. I couldn't connect with the strange lore of the faction. Didn't love it. Didn't feel it was an improvement over the original Slayer storyline, which I felt was so compelling in the beginning. But there you go. Okay, cool. We're going to do let's do Thalasar blue for the clothing. So this is Thalasar blue that I've mixed with medium prior. So this is a 1:1 mix of Thalasar blue and medium, which I keep pre-mixed in a bottle simply because I use it so often. And what I find is that this gives me a color that's a little bit more. It's got a little bit more of the correct mix of dark and light that I expect from a contrast paint. It's not so. It's a little bit more washed out, and therefore it isn't too dark the way I think neat Thalasar blue is. So as you apply this on, you get to see a lot more of a balanced mix of light and dark, and that does the trick for me. Okay. So in an ideal world, I would have let this dry fully, but because I intend to do these fairly quick, let's see what we can end up in an hour. Yeah, there we go. Whoop. And then now I realize that I've missed some silver areas. Oh, that's not drying properly, is it? Ooh. It's alright, we'll make do. Okay. So we'll pick up a little bit of the excess. And block in our orange to fix that. Okay. So a bit more of the blue to reinforce that. And deal with the underside. And once that's fully dry, we can move on to the next stage. So let's go on to identify, well, let's just go on to pick up some more details on his face, because I think his skin is blending a little bit too closely to the orange. So let's grab this. This is my go-to highlight for this mix of Guilliman flesh and Seraphim sepia. So light flesh from AK, but you could use any similar color. So as you can see, it's a fairly pale, almost off-white color. Add that to the contrast medium directly, and yes, you can highlight contrast mixed with highlights. Okay, that made no sense. You can highlight your contrast colors on the surface of the model, by mixing contrast paints with usually something to lighten the color. So white, bone, or this pale flesh mix will get you a color that's something that's an effective color that will blend into the finished paint, well, the finished shade that you have on your surface of your model. I think when I started working with contrast paints, I was always unsure what colors would actually function as highlights. That was just me being very skeptical at the beginning. I thought that it would be impossible to find colors that would effectively match the contrast paint for highlights. And then soon afterwards, I found that you could mix colors directly into the contrast paint. Although generally speaking, what you will want to do is to ensure that you use the color that was a lot thicker. So for example, when you mix white in, I like to use Vallejo whites, because generally speaking, the consistency is a lot thicker. So when you apply it to mix with the contrast paint, you would create a highlight that was of the right consistency, as opposed to one that was too thin. Were you to use a thinner consistency paint, you might create a highlight tone that's a bit too runny, and it might run into the recesses and ruin your detail. And we don't want that, do we? Yeah. So we are applying this over his nose, his cheeks, his forehead, and his other cheek, and over his shoulder, his hand over here. Yep. So that's already pulling the color a bit further from the orange, which we will go on to darken with a deeper shade in the recesses. The orange, I mean. Yeah. So a big part of painting hands is to always define the bones of the hands on the back. I find painting these really tends to reinforce visually the direction that the hand is facing, and making the model a lot easier to read as a result. Okay, so I think what we want to do next is to use a color that can universally shade both the orange and the flesh. And the color that I think is ideal for this is Gore Fur, just kind of a red brown. So I can find where it's gone on my table, which, to be fair, it's a bit of a mess right now. Lots of paints everywhere because I had an earlier painting session. Yeah, there we go. Gore Fur. So let's put this into some of the recesses to define them and help separate them visually. So that's a little pip of Gore Fur. So what we're going to do is we're going to define that part of the Slayer's hair where it contacts an adjacent material, so in the case of his skin, or where it will contact metal areas. And this really helps to define the recesses a little bit and to give it a bit more definition. Now in the past I would have painted something with so much texture on the surface with a dry brush, but I have found that I prefer the look that selective shading gives. Plus it tends to preserve the luminosity of the undercoat. That pale off-white color makes the final color scheme a lot more vibrant. Plus I find that as you get older, your eyesight goes down the tubes. So maybe working with something other than a black base coat, which I used to do for everything. I used to start all of my models by spraying them black. I found that this was okay, but well, to be fair, even back in the day, I found that I struggled to visually separate stuff on the surface. Like, it was hard for me to understand the logic of a lot of the geometry on the surface of a miniature. There's a little bit of guesswork, which wasn't great for the finish effect. Yeah, so I find this method of washes brings out the character of the surface a lot more easily, and I strain my eyes less as a result. So as mentioned earlier, where perhaps some of the paint has run into the recesses, we can fix that now with this Gore-Grunter mix. Or not mix, just Gore-Grunter fur cut with just a little bit of water. Okay. So this, by darkening the areas closer to the hair, you're really implying that those are the bits where his hair has grown out, and clearly this dwarf's hair originally was a reddish brown, and he's probably in need of a new dye job to refresh the orange in his hair. Yeah. Okay. So the more we apply Gore-Grunter fur into the recesses, the more contrast we are getting on the surface. Yeah. So a bit more Gore-Grunter fur I think would be useful. So let's refresh our dot on our wet palette, and let's continue to define some of these areas. Now the downside of diluting your contrast paint is that it does tend to dry a bit more slowly, as you can well see on this model. Some of the orange from the start of the session are still slightly damp, but we'll work around it. If you were not trying to cram this session into a 1 hour time slot, I would recommend that you probably well, what I would do personally is I would grab a hairdryer and give it a zap, or else you can slow down the process slightly, taking your time in between to let it dry. Or what I would do, if not working on a single model at once, would be, well, to work on this stage for an entire unit, and then as they dry, as one is drying, I will work on the next one, and so on and so forth. So we're getting there though with this model, despite our initial challenges. And we'll make it work. There we go. So I'm going to take the time to define the gaps in between his fingers as well with Gorgrunter fur. Gorgrunter fur I find is a nice progression shade, meaning the next darker color for Guilliman flesh. It works quite well. And it deepens the recesses pleasingly without introducing black into the mix, which would desaturate the recesses in an unrealistic way. Okay, cool. So I want to redefine. Ooh, okay, some silver has gotten into my Guilliman flesh, so a bit more of my Guilliman flesh mix, which I pre-mixed in a bottle. I love dropper bottles, by the way. I think they really help to organize your paints and stop them from drying out. Plus, they make mixing colors a lot easier. Like one drop by drop, you can just count the drops, on the wet palette instead of having to measure them out as brushfuls or anything like that. So you can put just dots on the surface and mix them together more successfully. Okay, let's reinforce the blue slightly. Okay. All right, so we're going to move on to shade the metal work on his weapon. So the thing about weapons is, so long as you've got a sort of working edge, you want to keep that silver, I have found. And then, any other filigree or detail work you can do in any other color. But keeping them metallic is usually the way to go. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some Nuln Oil. For those who have the more recent version of Nuln Oil, I find that adding a single drop of Black Legion or Black Templar, as the case may be, really fixes the issue of it being a lot weaker than its predecessors. I think the idea is that this recent version of Nuln Oil was designed to not stain. But I think a lot of us liked the staining that it would do on metal surfaces. It basically gave us a more nuanced form of shading, an in-between color, as it were, between the unshaded areas and on the edges and the super dark crevices. So having this in-between color was something that a lot of people missed when they first changed the formula. But as I said, it's easy to resolve. Just add a single drop of Black Legion. My preference is for Black Legion because it's a warm black, as opposed to putting a single drop of Black Templar, which was more of a cold black with a bit of a blue tinge to it. Okay. So you can slowly build up the black to be more impactful towards the bottom of the miniature. Yeah. And then we'll come back and then we'll do gold on the inlay areas, as well as all of the jewelry that's dripping all over his fingers. Kind of great. Really sells the idea of this being an experience and successful in battle, at least, Slayer. So I'm going back to refresh the silver in some areas where I might have missed. It's got these Celtic bands held by tension across his arm. And his rings, and his bangles and bracelets. Also his scrunchie. Along the way, since we've got the silver out, we can put silver on the edge of his weapon, just to refine the look, draw the eye to the edge, and suggest sharpness. There we go. Okay. Let's put on his ring. And then it's time to break out the gold. Now, I'm not entirely sure what I want to do for his X shaft. I'm guessing I will probably do it in red, just because that was iconic for that era. I also think I need to jump in and do his boots. Maybe the boots can be, and his X shaft can be brown. Maybe that would be a bit more normal. Yeah, let's try doing that. Let me reach for snakeback leather, which is again one of those extremely versatile contrast colors. And of course, the neutralness of the color makes it extremely hard to find in your collection when you need it. Pardon me. There we go. Snakeback leather. Don't mind the little dried clump of paint. So this we can put on his boots. Again, I'm kind of surprised that this dwarf is wearing boots. It's a good it's a good thing. Like, boots are excellent in general. For anyone who's actually gone into a cave before, you find that you fall in love with the idea of having really good shoes on. Shoes that help you grip various surfaces. Which I imagine all dungeon adventures are at least a proportion of spelunking. At least partially spelunking in some way. But yeah, if you've ever been to explore a cave before, excellent shoes are your top priority because they keep you alive. The next thing you want is a helmet. Really, really nice to have, to keep you from all the inevitable bumping on overhead surfaces. Alright, okay. So now we go on to work on the gold areas. For this, I intend to use my usual gold mix. So I've base coated all of the gold in silver, right? And that's just generally the way I prefer to work. I start with silver, and then I go in with a wash or a contrast layer of Nazdreg yellow and Agaros dunes. And I find between those two colors, you get a really effective one coat solution for gold that looks really like you spend a lot of time on it and has that sort of gradation of color that, you know, makes the details really pop. So we go over the surface with this, and as you can see, it's adding a lot of luster to the gold, especially over the bright silver. And this gives us a nice, effective one-coat solution for all the gold details, all the bling, of which this dwarf has a ton. Because he's a terrible slayer for having lived this long and amassed this much jewelry, and for being the absolute badass that he clearly is. So this goes directly over the silver, and as you can see, it's making it look a lot more gold than one might initially think. And because we're not just necessarily drenching the surface, but channeling this shading color into all the grooves that serve to define the surface. Both right now when the paint is still wet, as well as in potential like subsequent layers, you can actually channel the gold quite nicely in such a way as to make sure that the details stand out beautifully. So not to forget all the little ancestor heads all over him, of which, as I mentioned, there are many. And his kind of Dacian clasp, is that a Celtic or a Dacian thing with the two serpent heads over his arm? And as it begins to dry, we can come in and reinforce this a little bit more to get a little bit more nuance out of the gold, a little bit more on the edges, so that the two are they monster heads? Are they troll heads on his double bitted axe stand out as they deserve. The next step, I think, is to come in over his hair with a bit of a dry brush, which, as it turns out in this day and age, is a technique that I don't use as much as I used to, but definitely still has its place. So not to forget his rings. So bling on this gentleman. When I was a kid, I used to run into a lot of these older guys in Singapore, and they would wear all these rings. It's something that's kind of fallen out of favor, I think. But yeah, older guys used to wear a lot of rings back in the day, and I imagine this dwarf is one of those. He might not know the significance of the ring that he finds, or maybe they're rings of his family members, bringing into context his Slayer oath. But yeah, maybe every ring is a wrong that he needs to right. It's tough to be a Slayer. Okay, I'm going to reinforce the snakebite leather on his boots a little bit more. Make sure that I get around the edges of his shoes so that there's a nice contrast with the base. A little bit more darkening around the edge of the axe. To help the gold pop out further. So this is with our little puddle of non-oil that we have from earlier. None of it goes to waste. Bearing in mind that we want to keep the edges bright silver still, we can continue to reinforce this to make sure that we don't lose that hard silver edge. Okay. So let's come in with something of a bright dry brush over his hair. For this purpose, I imagine maybe something like this would work. Light orange, which is my go-to highlight. For red, but I think it will suit our needs just fine for orange today. So let's saturate a dry brush and then very carefully brush inwards against the grain to pick up some of that glorious texture. We'll do that as well at all of the extremities of his beard, as well as his awe-inspiring hairstyle. And there's no real need to overdo this stage. It's just there to reinforce the shape of it. And at the end of the day, if you can hold the model at arm's length and you can see the fan of his hair, then that is just perfect. You don't need to go too much further than that. It's got a lot of beard, isn't it? Okay, so now we're going to go in with a little bit of our original our original undercoat color, and mix some blue in, Thalasar blue that we used earlier, and we're going to reinforce the highlights. That may be a little bit too intense. Might need a bit more Thalasar blue. Let's see how it goes. No, I think it's alright. So long as we keep this highlight small and sharp, it shouldn't be too overwhelming. So, an important question is, to what extent should we highlight something? We've all seen models that are kind of over highlighted, and models which are almost certainly under highlighted. And it turns out the proportion of space on the model that you devote to highlights or shading really does have an important impact on a major impact on whether that model reads as shiny and reflective or else relatively matte, like a fabric, like cotton, or shiny like silk, for example. So if we devote too much real estate to highlights, we end up with something that looks a little bit more washed out. But if we keep the highlights nice and sharp, it can almost look reflective in that sense. A bit like the way non-metallic metals concentrate highlights on the very edges, brightening them up artificially and suggesting the look of chrome. So this is information that we can use to our advantage, right? If we want to sort of mimic the look of silk, for example, we can use almost a non-metallic metal style of highlighting and make it look really eye-catching and bright. Or as is in the case of the Slayer, what we're doing is we're putting lots of light color, blue, and leaving only the dark blue in the recesses to make it look faded and worn. I don't imagine this Slayer goes through many pairs of pants. Or maybe he does. Maybe he is a fashion conscious Slayer. He certainly has a status for it. So Slayers in Warhammer Quest are spectacular. They are amazing fighters, really effective, but they have a tendency to die, not because they're ineffective or anything, They are certainly amazing fighters. It's just you really are up against the worst dangers in the Warhammer world. I'm going back to reinforce more gold. Warhammer Quest can be a really lethal place, and it's even worse when you're a slayer running around in your underwear. Bad stuff. So many things can kill you, and regularly do. So in Warhammer Quest, my gaming group has run through so many slayers at this point. It's a bit hard to keep track of. We had dwarves that die and then their relatives become slayers. And then those slayers go on to lose themselves in dungeons because the rule is that slayers can never ever flee from a combat. And therefore they will go down fighting to the bitter end, as the case may be. And as the case tends to turn out. Because as I mentioned, yes, Warhammer Quest is absolutely lethal. Absolutely lethal. So many things kill you, often within one hit, especially when you're a low level fledgling hero and you don't have that many wounds or a capable healer in the party. One thing that slayers could do was munch on stone bread. It's part of their whole shtick of self-reliance and being extremely tough. They could eat chunks of bread, chewing on them in the middle of a combat or staring down the foe. Imagine that was a pretty terrifying thing for the enemy. But there you go, that's the reputation and the ability of slayers. Terrifying. So let's go on to work on the base. So for this purpose, I tend to use my own mix or that approximates Ageros dunes, which I again cannot find on my table. Will the Ageros dunes please stand up? Please? Where has it gone? Sorry, guys. This is today's mystery. My goodness, where has it gone? Aha! It was hiding in the back. So this is an approximation of Ageros dunes. It's actually a mix of raw umber, sepia, I think, as well as a little bit of raw umber, sepia, and goodness, what is it? It's a mix of sepia paint, burnt umber, and raw sienna. Now, I'll put the recipe for this Ageros Dunes analog in the description so that you can mix it up if you want. But really, if you're doing large quantities, only if you're really doing large quantities on your model's basis. If you're just going to do, you know, a regular number of miniatures basis, I would imagine you would just want to pick up a bottle and use that instead. So this gives me a decent looking base color over which I can add additional details as the case may be. I don't necessarily always do it, simply because I find this consistent base approach makes models look good en masse without having to resort to all sorts of finicky little details like static grass and so on, but you could very easily go down that route if you so chose, right? Working over this as a base, and it would look pretty impressive, to be fair. Okay, so the next thing is to work on the base edge. Once this has settled a little bit, I'm gonna get all the little spaces in between his legs. So I'm gonna pull him off the base. And for the edging, I tend to do what used to be called scorch brown, what today I believe is called Rhinox hide. But I tend to use a non-Games Workshop color simply because I think it is closer to what the color of that used to be, and that scale colors brown leather. Scale colored brown leather gives me that nostalgic look, as well as being relatively hard wearing a surface. It doesn't rub off easily, and it is pleasantly matte finished. All of which are characteristics I look for in a paint for the edges of my miniature, just to finish it off to this level. Now I fully intend to come in and add additional details to the gemstones, and probably do his eyes as well, which I have not done at this stage. But for now, this works for me. This level of finish works for me, and I think he's good enough to go on the gaming table to start carving up the horrible beasties of the old world. Okay, thanks for watching, guys. We will come back to this model at some point to do a little bit more additional detailing work, but for now, this is where we are at. Thanks for joining me. Like and subscribe if you want to see more, and definitely let me know in the comments whether there are particular models you would like to see me tackle in this style. And yeah, I'll see you again. Cheers.